Hello, everyone. Thank you for waiting and to the panel. And we're now going to introduce. I'm going to introduce two people, and Nadia is has kindly agreed to introduce the other two people. And then we'll have a discussion. So I'm going to read from my notes. Sorry. Okay, first with us here in London is, sorry, I can't see, Teodora Kosanovic, and she is a filmmaker from the former Yugoslavia. She was granted asylum in the UK in the late 90s following the Yugoslav wars. And she's currently writing a master's thesis on the politics of experimental and amateur film in post-war Yugoslavia. Amazing. Thank you.
Hello.
And then I have to say I'm very honored to introduce my sister from different parents, but the same. Fernanda Milan, was the first transgender woman to be granted asylum in Denmark following persecution in her home country of Guatemala. Having successfully campaigned for her own asylum with activists from various LGBT groups in Denmark and across Europe and some other parts of the world, Fernanda has gone on to collaborate with Transaction in Denmark. In her role as an independent activist, she gives public speeches at other organizations and universities, raising awareness of the issues faced by trans women. She also volunteers as a spokesperson on human trafficking, a fate faced by many cis and trans women across the world. Gracias, Fernanda. Now I pass the mic to...
Okay, so we're now on to the next part. I don't know if I'm so short, I can't actually just move a bit nearer. Okay, hopefully that you can hear me. So I'd like to introduce the two people I've invited tonight. On my left here is Anna-Zora Tickley, who is a contemporary of mine, and both of us have parents that came from South Africa, were part of the liberation struggle in exile here in London. We both came from North London, so this is Anna-Zora, and she's an activist and an author. And this is her son, Ishmael, whose father's also here in the audience, and he is a student. So hopefully between our four participants, we can generate an interesting conversation, and there'll be an opportunity towards the end for some comments, thoughts, questions from all of you. So in preparation for this evening's event, I was thinking about Refugee Week, and I thought it was interesting that Newington Green Meeting House, with the people that are so supportive here, on their flyer, they said they didn't just say mark Refugee Week, they put, celebrate Refugee Week, and I thought that was really interesting because actually this kind of raising awareness that definitely came through in Yannick's film, and hopefully in the discussion we're going to have. There are so many different connotations around these words, and some negativity, but possibly some sense of collectivism that will come through. So in terms of this evening, because we're coming from very different places, our participants, geographically, in terms of background, and what brings us to this evening, I've got some general ideas that I was kind of mulling over, and I was thinking that in some ways they're very obvious, I suppose, when we're thinking about Refugee Week, but I think they can be interpreted in different ways. And the themes that I kind of like us to maybe keep in mind, but obviously you will answer questions in your own way, are the ideas of safety, resistance, journeying, belonging, home, and the layers of meanings around identity or multiple identities that we feel either define us or maybe don't define us. So I'm hoping that within these quite generic questions, that you will feel the sort of space to answer. Sorry, I'm putting Fernanda's up there and kind of talking up there to you. The space to answer in a way that you feel comfortable and kind of just, provide whatever as much depth as you'd like. So my first question, perhaps what I'll do, so you don't feel left out, Fernanda, I might ask you to, because you're out of.
Not at all, I'm very present, no problem.
Okay, well, I'll put the question out and you can all be thinking about it before we come to your answers. But my first question is, can each of you tell us briefly how you came to be born here, or wherever you were born, came to be here rather, and whether you would call yourself an exile, a refugee, an asylum seeker, or perhaps none of these? And also, and part of that question is whether it's kind of come through in the film, the stigma or potential stigma attached to these terms. So really, what's brought you to either here or there, and the issues of safety, resistance, and the terminology around these. So perhaps we'll start with you, because I said that we'll start with you.
Okay, hi, my name is Fernanda. I'm from Guatemala. Thank you, Thais, for introducing me. I was thinking and what you were saying about celebrating refugees, and I'm not against on celebrating our lives and our surviving skills. What I don't think is something that resonates with me is to celebrate the fact that we are refugees, or the fact that the world has been for so many years in such a state that we have the necessity to migrate to protect our lives. After 13 years of not being in Guatemala, I can tell practically that I am a refugee, that I was an asylum seeker, that I am a migrant, definitely, but I feel foreign, like a foreigner in Denmark, and I'm sure I'm going to feel a foreigner in Guatemala if I ever come back. It's like this gift or curse, depends on the way that you see it, that you don't belong, right? It's like, I know that there's so many people that want me here in Denmark or want us here in Europe. There's the system that doesn't want us and is mostly designed to throw us out or to send us back, or any other unwelcoming practices that they have. But I feel like what defined me the most is feeling foreign in wherever I go, because I don't have this sense of belonging. And that's a very difficult thing to process, to accept, and to live with. But at the end of the day, I think it's a reality that you cannot escape, and that you learn to cope, and you find even happiness in the fact that you are this person. So yeah, I don't know if that covers completely your question.
Well, no, it's whatever your answer is your answer. So I think that's the thing, is we're trying to deal with some very complex terms and whether they really connect with us. So thank you. I'll move on to you now.
Thank you. So yeah, I would consider myself a former refugee, I suppose, and these terms are very problematic for me because I've lived here for such a long time. I've lived in the UK for about 23 years now, and I came to this country when I was about 4 years old following the NATO bombings of Yugoslavia. And when I came to this country, my family were very much... I came with my mother and my brother, and I think the main thing that made us feel like we didn't belong was the bureaucracy and the kind of process of being an asylum seeker and finding somewhere to live and things to do with work. So my mother, like, you can't work in this country for a certain amount of time, and that was obviously very difficult for our family. I have a British accent and I seem very British and I present like a British person, but I don't identify as a British person. I also don't identify as a Serbian, which is where I'm from. I identify as a Yugoslavian, but it's not a country anymore. So this is a kind of complex thing of, I come from a country that doesn't exist. So that kind of adds another layer to not belonging. I don't really have a place of origin anymore. And in terms of identity, yeah, just, it's very difficult to grasp that as somebody who's, been a refugee in this country.
Well, we'll revisit that in a minute.
Yeah.
Not that I'm trying to tidy it up, but just that, so we can kind of focus. Okay, so I'll go to Anna Zora first, if you don't mind, Ishmael, just because of the kind of intergenerational kind of connection.
Yes, so I came, my father came to this country as an exile from South Africa because he was an activist in the ANC and was brought up amongst a big community of ANC exiles in Muswell Hill and the surrounding area. So I saw at first hand the experience of people who had been taken away from their country and were making a life in a new country, and the different responses that were received from a very hostile Thatcherite government as I got older, and the racism that was within British society as well was very prevalent during those years, but also a lot of warmth and solidarity with British people. So as a child of an exile, which is what I would describe myself to be, I felt very much British and very much the child of the ANC in exile rather than a South African, because we didn't really have big connections with our family in South Africa. And so then when the ANC was unbanned and the struggle in a way was over here, I then decided to stay here, and I do feel very British, but very, very much part of a diaspora community and very involved in the anti-racist struggles, as I inevitably was, or I was, having been brought up as I was, and absolutely furiously angry with what's happened here and the way that refugees are being demonised and the way that they're being treated, and it's getting worse and worse. And so every day I'm very, very angry, but I'm not surprised, because this is a feature of a capitalist society. The economic system that we live in is always going to scapegoat people, and it's always going to use the most vulnerable people in society as an excuse so that the dreadful disparity between rich and poor can be perpetuated, and this is really becoming extremely extreme, and I think we're at a crisis point. So I suppose my background makes me very sensitive to that, but not necessarily more than anybody else.
Okay, last but not least, Ishmael, as the next generation, with your mum's background as it is, a little bit about how you connect with those terms, or don't, please.
Am I audible? Is that fine?
You're the most audible
of all of us. Yes, I think, so immediately I feel like a sense of disconnect from the terms, I think, just because of, I've grown up in this country, my mum grew up in this country. I've spent all 22 years of my life here. And I think there's a strange, and also sort of, because of the fact of my grandfather being a refugee, there's also a sense of disconnect I feel from South Africa, which is where he grew up. And so I think, as far as my relationship to the term goes and how it's impacted me, I think the impacts are maybe more subtle, less sort of easy to see, at least for myself, when I've had to kind of dig a bit deeper to sort of fully appreciate them. I think in maybe sort of the negative sense, if I could put it in like simple terms. I think it's maybe the lack of a sort of wide extended family, which I've had access to throughout my life because of this disconnect my grandfather had to have as an exile from South Africa. But then sort of also in the more positive sense, I think, and it was interesting watching the film earlier and kind of considering this, sort of the ideas which of sort of within the refugee community of sort of the humanist ideas, or the ideas of sort of community and sort of care more generally, which sort of seem to be fostered in that environment. And I think sort of how those similar ideals are maybe reflected in my own upbringing and how my parents chose to raise me, and sort of and what was sort of cultivated in our sort of smaller family structure. So in that sense, although I wouldn't identify with the status of a refugee, I still try and appreciate the ways in which sort of these histories have formed me as a person.
It's really interesting. Thank you all for that. And some of my next question kind of overlaps with what we've already covered, so you can take out what you want from it. But I've sort of thought about if safety or the risk of danger led you or your family members to leave their country of birth to the possibility of safety elsewhere. How has that action impacted your own sense of identity? So I'm just thinking about people who choose, the difference between people who choose to go to another land because they want to improve their lives, they want to travel, they've got a great job, or they've met the love of their life and that person happens to live somewhere else. All the reasons that aren't connected to safety or trauma, whether that kind of history impacts you in terms of the generation before. So yeah, we'll do it again as this. And Fernando, I know it's slightly different in terms of your position, but please tell us what you think.
Well, I cannot help it but to see what you said in a very intersectional way. For me, it's not only one reason. Violence for me is not a very foreign situation. I have been in violence all my life because I'm a woman. I happen to be trans. I happen to be of color. So all those intersections put me in the position of having to flee my country, as you say, the difference of traveling because or migrating because you want to, or you found the love of your life, or all of that. It's just like I was subjected to violence, and I was at risk of losing my life. But when I came to Denmark, I was also subjected to violence because my gender identity wasn't recognized. So I was housed with men in a refugee camp, and I suffer sexual violence, verbal harassment. And I didn't find safety in a general sense. I found safety of my immediate threat. Then I was subjected to another kind of violence. And of course, it got better, and things have been much peaceful lately. But I think my identity is not constructed, and I don't identify as a victim or a survivor. I'm just a person who has to have gone through those migrations in my life, to have to get out of these situations that put my life in risk. And I end up living in Denmark, which has its own set of problematic, it exists still racism in a very subtle sometimes way, and in a very scary way sometimes. It feels like a barrier of language. There's a barrier of how people perceive me. So to define my identity as easily as that would be complicated, but it is defined by many factors. But I think I would define myself as a person who can remove herself from a dangerous situation, and no matter how much suffering and so much danger, I survive. And I think I cannot separate that identity from being a refugee or for being a person who got asylum. And that is fine with me. It's beautiful, but there are so many other things that define me besides being someone who is not European. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Theo, do you want to add anything?
I guess, is this working? I don't know. Hello? 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 Yeah? Oh, okay. All right, it's working. I guess my main point would be safety, often for refugees, I believe, comes from the goodness of individual people rather than from the state that you happen to move to. And I think that's maybe the key point here, is that safety is completely dependent on people like us, I guess. So that's how my family found safety here, is through the goodness of people helping us find a place to live. We lived in a bed and breakfast for about 3 years when we moved here, and that was a good place to be rather than a homeless shelter. And that was through the help of one woman who I want to get in contact with one day because she was a wonderful person. And then she helped us move out of that place to a rented accommodation, and that really felt like a home at the time, and it helped me kind of develop in my life as just develop as everybody else did, like as a little kid in England. But that was really through an individual that helped us out. And we went through so many obstacles before then. We had some vague family members here, which is why we were even granted asylum in the first place, in this country specifically. We had other options as well. I think sometimes people talk about how, oh, why didn't you go somewhere else? You know, why here? It's like, well, we had some connections, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And we only stayed with them for a couple of weeks. And then there was some people that we met through them that tried to deport us and reported us and to the Home Office, and were like, we think this family should go back home, because my father was still in Serbia at the time. So that was really difficult. And I found some documents a couple of years ago that were, my mum had to go to court to kind of state her case of why we shouldn't be deported. And it was talking about me as this little kid who was in school, and all the great things that I was doing in school, and all the, I was playing violin, or I was hanging out with all the kids, and I was learning the language really well and all this stuff. And it's just really strange to have that detachment from yourself in that way, being talked about in this kind of clinical way in a court. So really, and then we had a really good lawyer. We had a guy that was incredible, who really fought for our case. So again, it's an individual helping us out. So I think that's what I take from this, is that actually individual people help so much, more than the state. So I think, yeah, we should carry on doing that.
Thank you for that. Okay, Anazora, yeah.
Well, the apartheid regime was a terrifying, violent regime, and it did its utmost to it meted out violence, obviously, in South Africa massively, and also it spread around, and it did target the exiles. And there were terrible acts of violence that, growing up, we were very, very aware of. So that did affect me a lot, and it has stayed with me a lot. And one key event was at the Anti-Apartheid, at the ANC office, which is now the Anti-Apartheid Centre, the Legacy Centre, where there was a bomb that went off there. And I remember that very clearly when that happened and how frightening that was. And also the murder of Dulcie September, who was in the equivalent office, ANC office in Paris, which was absolutely dreadful. So I think it really has stayed with me, and I'm glad if the Legacy Centre is marking that and we're remembering that. So yes.
Thank you. Ishmael, knowing that history of your mum and her father, has that kind of been present in your kind of thinking about these things?
Yeah, well, I think that it's knowing this history, as you put it, is like crucial for understanding where this kind of violence is then reproduced in the modern day in a way which is maybe slightly more adjacent to my own existence, and sort of how an appreciation of that history, an appreciation of the history of migration and exile, sort of in conjunction with an intersectional approach, and sort of thinking more broadly about different communities in the world at the moment, how that can, I guess, cultivate a moral character in a very vague sense. And how that can be, how by reproducing that is, at least on a personal level, a better way to mitigate the violence which has been reproduced.
Yeah, the state, the person and the state violence, yeah. Thank you. And some of this has actually come up already in Fernanda's contribution, and so this is a very broad one, and I kind of feel that there are links and there's some diversions in this. But I wondered to what extent the four of you feel that the areas of race, class, gender, sexuality, religion define you, or is this more fluid depending on who you are with or the context in which you're operating in your lives? And have there been times when one of these areas, whatever it may be, has been dominant, or where you felt it's been forced to be centre stage, and how you feel about that? Because I think the identity politics is very current, and but I think it's become very, in my view, very, very complex. And I'm just wondering within that, this idea of the individual and how the individual may or may not connect to those terms, those labels, and whether they're helpful, I guess, or not, in defining us, or are they restrictive, I guess. Fernanda, sorry, I'm looking up like I'm looking up at you, but...
Yeah, I've been thinking so much about this because I have found myself lately in so much, I found myself so much in rage and anger of all this discussion about my existence as a migrant, as a woman of color, as a trans woman, etc. And I think like the most difficult part for me to go through that intersectionality that is my being is the tags and the boxes that people want to put on me. Like I have to be a refugee that is grateful of being in Denmark. I have to be a gracious survivor of sexual assault in a refugee camp. I have to be a specific kind of person that I not always want to live up to. So it does affect my view of the world. Never mind, I guess it affects the way that I see myself also, because it's very harsh to listen to all these anti-refugee, anti-trans woman, anti-woman, anti-person of color rhetoric all the time. So, of course, I am angry, but I cannot find, at least right now, I cannot find those external impulses to define me. I just feel like I'm a very strong person and I can navigate through those impositions. But it's a very difficult task to be right now. It's like some years might be easier because I don't know, the system is less complicated to navigate. But right now, I think what defines me really is my anger. And never mind that anger is my happy place because I think from anger you can construct and you can help people. I mean, there was like somebody was saying here that I found kindness in a community here, not from the system. And I can give back that kindness and that strength and that survival skills in other people who come to this country in the same situation as me. So, yeah.
Thank you, thank you. Teo, you've already touched on some of this, which I thought was really interesting about this idea of British and a country that no longer exists. So is there anything you wanted to add to that? Because I know you've already talked about it a bit.
I guess for me it's almost like the opposite issue where I'm very privileged that I'm white and European. So outwardly, I don't struggle a lot of the time. It's very much an internal thing. So I can pretend that none of this exists, like none of this has ever happened, which in a way is a really big privilege. I can, to completely erase that part of my life. But in another way, it's like an internal struggle as much is something that I think a lot of refugees do experience, that even though we do end up fitting into society as much as like anyone else, that it is an internal struggle and it is about finding that community of people that you can identify with. So I think that's the main thing. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point. I mean, I could talk to you about that for ages, out of interest, the idea of how we perceive ourselves and how other people perceive us and how that then feeds into our sense of who we are, according to somebody else's criteria or other people's criteria. Anna Zora, is there anything?
Yes, I don't think I explained that my father is an Indian. He was an Indian South African. My mother's a white Scottish person. And so I'm mixed race, British, the child of an exile. And I think that at this time, I'm feeling that my experience and how I was brought up in the values of the Freedom Charter, the ANC when it was a revolutionary organisation, of the anti-racist struggles that worked with the anti-apartheid movement in this country, I feel more than ever how they form me, and that it's so vital that our race identities are combined with the class identity and the class struggle. Our Home Secretary, Priti Patel, is also from an Indian African origin. She also came to this country from there, and her trajectory has been in such a different direction. And she is now meting out this horrific treatment to people, and which only really brings home to me that we have got to change the economic system that we work in, that we live in, and the race struggle has got to go hand in hand with class liberation as well. And I feel that very deeply from my own experience.
Thank you, Anna Zora. So it's the next generation from that. You've touched on it a bit already, Ishmael, but is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I can give it a go.
There's no pressure, you don't have to add to it. I mean, is there anything that you want to say that diverges from your mum, or is there anything?
Well, I think just maybe just building on, very generally speaking, what everyone's been saying. I think you made a good point at the beginning, quickly, that so identity politics is a complicated issue at the moment, but also very prescient. And I think part of the reason it's quite complicated is that under this very broad umbrella term is this, at least what I've been thinking about at the moment, is subsumed this almost kind of state-sponsored, top-down sort of narrative of black identity and also migration in general. And I think so. In the last few years, Windrush has been the big sort of the buzzword. And so, recently there was that meeting, sort of that celebration which involved certain members of the royal family, I believe. I kind of skimmed those articles. And I think it's interesting because that kind of, the way in which that narrative is then sort of projected onto the country in a very sort of, in a sense of, in after nation build almost. I think not only does that undermine the kind of complexity of those patterns of migration subsumed within that term, but also fails to appreciate the sort of numerous other migrations, patterns of migration, both before and after that post-war period, which have sort of impacted Britain and affected the identity of black people and people of colour. And I think, I can't remember what your original question was, but if it was anything like my
No, it was just the different aspects of gender, race, class, whether, you felt that you had to define yourself at any point as maybe more one thing or the other by somebody else's terms in a way.
Yes, on that note, then you can say that. So then, at least from my perspective, I'm the child of sort of migration of both sides, neither of which seem to fit in with that narrative. Then I guess the next steps perhaps could be to sort of orient myself, my personal life, more politically, and then see how uncovering those narratives of my own, reflected in the journey of my father and also my mum's history and my granddad's history as an exile, how those would then disrupt these more, I guess, the phrase I used was top-down narratives.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's fascinating, all of this. I'm going to move on to the last part. Actually, just one thing I wanted to say about Windrush, because when you were talking, I think that's very interesting, it's so topical, but also I felt very much like you that it's become a very convenient construction around which people will celebrate this, the visuals. It's London is a place for me. It's the boat. It's also very romantic, and then people forget those very same people that they were deporting, and also that black people have been here for thousands of years, right? So it's a very complex debate about how people are kind of showcased, I think, when it suits a government, a society, the Jubilee, and at other times they're kind of, the very same people are vilified. So I think that's a really important area that you raised. So my final question is, again, has kind of come in, and it's really interesting listening to the four of you, that my own experience is completely different. So it kind of just shows when we're talking about this idea of refugees, asylum seekers, what does that mean? It's not homogenous, I guess, and we have these alignments at certain points in our lives or at certain moments, but perhaps are far more fractured than we kind of necessarily acknowledge or can see. So my final question is, what does the notion of home mean to you? Is it geographical? Is it physical, spiritual, emotional, or is it ever changing? Is it fixed or ever changing? So it's kind of quite a complex lot. So what does it actually mean? I'll leave it at that, and then maybe you can just tell us what you feel.
I'm going to be bossy and just say, can you make sure you speak into the microphone?
Sorry, yes. Did you hear that, Fernanda?
50%.
You're only hearing me now because I'm reaching forward. So I was asking what home means to you. I mean, you've already kind of touched on this already, but is it, and I think I kind of can anticipate a little bit of what you're saying because of what you shared already, but, Guatemala was your home, and, what does it mean? Is it a geographical place? Is it internal, spiritual? Is it all those things? Has it been forced to become something that's more fluid, or is it, do you feel it? Will you tell us what you understand by that?
Yeah, when you said fluid, it rang the bell for me, is not physical, not geographical, is where the people I love is, like I have so many sisters, so many siblings in life that I have found and I have chosen where they are. That is my home. I'm happily married with a wonderful person where this person is also my home. But I have learned to disengage from that uh, idea that home has to be where my blood family is, or where I come from, or my country, or even the food that I adore and I miss so much. I have to learn how to let go, because I believe that I have been obligated to learn to find love, wellness, and acceptation as my home. And I'm very happy that I have found it through the years in different places with different people who might or not be with us, who might or not be in my life. But love is where you are loved and where you are respected. And that is beautiful that you can find that everywhere. Yeah.
That's really lovely. Thank you. Okay, so Teo, home. You've touched on it in your previous answers, but
I think Fernanda said it very well, so I don't really have that much more to add. But yeah, home for me isn't really a physical place. I mean, Britain sometimes feels like a home, but I think it's very much in other people and in the love that you find in wherever you are. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
For me, actually, are different in that I feel very, very, very attached to Haringey, to Green Lanes and Finsbury Park, and I think I always will be. It's where I grew up in Haringey, and I've always stayed here, and maybe that's because of my background and the experience that I've had. So just wanting to carry on living here and help make it a better place.
Thank you. Ishmael.
And yeah, then coincidentally, I've also never left Harringay. So maybe I'll be able to tell you what home is once I have. But yeah, back to my first answer, sort of maybe just ideas of care and community which have been fostered in our sort of small family life. I think those are good examples of what home would mean. That's as specific as I can get.
Well, I think the fact that you doesn't appear that you've got an idea of the politics, but it doesn't sound like you've struggled a lot with those issues as a kind of reflection on the kind of nurturing and stability that your parents have offered you. So I think that's quite an interesting idea of the generational impact. I just wondered if we've got a couple of, are there any questions or comments that anybody wants to make, ask, before we wrap up? Yes, Alinta. Yeah. Do we need to give you a mic? You okay? Oh, thank you. Oh. Closer to
Yeah,
me.
can you please speak?
Sorry,
Very, very
I'm
close.
only getting the hang of it now. Okay.
Thanks. Who was?
Yeah, I just wanted to first thank everyone for their, to share their personal experience. But I was thinking about the film, and I was trying to see the correlation because at the moment of the film they are talking about language as a weapon, and I think I guess as well because I'm not a native speaker. I'm just trying. I would like to understand, and probably it's like more Theodora or Fernanda that could speak about that, your relationship with like languages where you are a refugee or even like immigrants, because I've observed working with young people or even around me how people assume that you're stupid because you don't speak the language, and that's the first struggle because you can't voice sometime, or you can't just to go through, I'm just thinking the NHS, or just to go through the administration. So I just wanted to know what were your experience relating to languages, and maybe it could, apply to you as well. Yeah.
Is that specifically to Fernanda?
Fernanda, and maybe, I don't know if Theodora remembers. Theo, sorry. Remembers, but yeah.
Well, thinking what you were saying exactly, like language is such a powerful thing, and being able to communicate and understand what is happening. For refugees in Denmark, that is, I don't know if the second or third more difficult language to learn in the world, especially for me as a Latina, that I have never heard anything like Danish before. The problem was that even my English wasn't that bad. It wasn't my mother tongue. So the vulnerability, that not being able to understand what is happening and not being able to be understood, is enormous. Sadly, because of this, I end up being human trafficked here in Denmark, which is a very tragic and very terrible consequence that I wish refugees, especially women of color, wouldn't be at risk of, but we are. And I think language is a big factor in this vulnerability and in this risk, because not only that, it is maybe to fall in love with the wrong person, maybe to hang out with the wrong crew, but the risk and the stakes are so high that I think, like, the system and we as a community, we need to be more effective in to let people to be understood, to understand what is their position, and above all, to understand what are the risks as refugees, as migrants, as foreigners, or whatever is the situation that you are in another country. I think we as a community, we need to step up and be able to make communication and language a skill and not a weapon that could be very dangerous for us, for all of us who come to an unknown place. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else want to ask or comment about anything? No? Okay. Yes? No? Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you then to everyone that's participated, Fernanda, Teo, Ishmael, and Azora, and for all of you for coming. And also, once again, to thank everyone here at Newington Green Meeting House for hosting this and putting on such a diverse lot of programming for the community in this great space. And also the tech support upstairs, who I haven't even said hello to properly, and Saul, who has been filming tonight, and Olia, who's been taking photographs. So, and all of you for coming, and hopefully this will be the start of more conversations and more engagement in the local community. So thank you very much.
Solid applause you got. Very respectful.
I was trying to.
Do you want to say goodbye to Fernanda?
Well, same, Amy, Banu, and everyone. We want to say thank you, everyone, for coming. And Fernanda, I'm going to turn around. Don't hang up. I'm going to go up in a minute so you can see my beautiful face. No cuelgues, güey. Gracias. Thank you so much. And solidarity to Denmark. No cuelgues, güey.